Eastern North Carolina Radio's reading service, a United Way partner agency. We welcome you to this program entitled Off the Book. Your reader is Nehemiah Suber, and I will be continue reading Slavery by Another Name, written by Douglas A. Blackman. Despite Bibb County's remote location, far from any of the most famous military campaigns, the Civil War had not been a distant event. In the early month of fighting, Alabama industrialists realized that the market for iron sufficient for armament would be lucrative in the South. In 1860, only Tredard Iron Works, a vast industrial enterprise in Richmond, Virginia, driven by more than 450 slaves and nearly as many free laborers, could produce battle-ready cannon for the South. The Confederate government, almost from the moment of its creation, set out spurs additional capacity to make arms, particularly in Alabama, where a nascent iron and coal industry was already emerging and little fighting was likely to occur. During the war, a dozen or more new iron furnaces were put into blast in Alabama. By 1864, the state was pumping out 4 times more iron than any other southern state. Across Alabama, individual property holders, slaveholders especially, were aggressively encouraged to attempt primitive industrial effort to support the Confederate war efforts. The rebel government often generous inducement to entrepreneurs and large slave owners to devote their resources to the South's industrial needs. With much of the major plantation areas of Mississippi under constant federal harassment, thousands of slaves were without work. Slave owners willing to transport their black workers to the new mining region of Alabama and dig coal could avoid conscription into the Southern armies. After seeing their homes in Cockpill of Cotton Burn, W.A. and Louis Thomas, brother of Hens County, Mississippi, and the owners of large numbers of slaves, moved Bibb County midway through the way to the mine to mine the Shabbat coal field for Confederacy. They opened the Lower Thomas mine, and later another relative and his slaves arrived to dig another mine. The coal was hauled even for 11 miles to Ashby and shipped it to Selma. The mining was true, usually picks a hand-pulled car. The slave drained water from the shaft by carrying buckets up the surface. A neighbor of the Cunningham local farm, Oliver Frost, regularly took his slaves to a cave in 6 Mill Creek to mine saltpeter, a critical ingredient of gunpowder for the Confederate Army, often remaining there for weeks at a time. The Fancer family, on a farm 3 miles north of the Crossroad community called 6 Mill, regularly hauled limestone from a quarry on their property to a Bibb County furnace during the war. The centerpiece of the Alabama military enterprise was a massive and heavy fortified arsenal, naval foundry, ironwork, and gunpowder mill located in the city of Selma. To produce its weapons and metal plating for use on ironclad ships critical to the Confederate limited naval operation, the Selma works relied on enormous amounts of coal and iron or mined and forged in nearby Shelby and Bibb County. Alabama iron was particularly well suited to use in the revolutionary new development of fortifying battleships with steel plates. Iron forged at Alabama's Cane Creek furnace in Cuyahoga County had been utilized for a portion of the armor to convert the whole of the captured U.S. Merrimack into the CSS Virginia. The southern entrant in the famous March 8, 1864 Battle of Ironclad. The Confederate was hungry for as much of the material as it could possibly get. Of particular strategic value were ironwork established by local investors in 1862 in the village of Bearfield, 9 miles from the Cunningham Place. The Bearfield Ironworks produces the plates that adored the Confederate vessel CSS Tennessee, which during the Battle of Mobile Bay on August 5, 1864, withstood the barrage of 17 Union vessels without a single shot penetrating her hull. Bibb County iron quickly became a convent material. As the war escalated, maintaining production required an increased number of slaves. Agents from major factories, Bearfield Iron and the Shelby Iron Works, scoured the countryside to buy or release African Americans. Foundries routinely commissioned labor agents to prowl across the southern states in search of valued slaves. In 1863, the Confederate government purchased Bearfield operation for $600,000, so it could be directly controlled, so that it could directly control its output. The purchase encompassed its property of all kinds whatsoever, including thousands of acres of land, a catalog of a dozen wagon, wheelbarrow, coal sled, axes, and blacksmith tools. On the list of livestock were 70 mules, 41 oxen, and 9 black men. John Anderson, age about 35, Dennis about 38, George about 30, Charles about 74, Perry about 40, Curry about 17, Matthew about 35, Moses about 18, and Esquire about 30. The Confederate government began construction of a second furnace at the site shortly after acquiring the property. All of its output went to Selma Arsenal, 50 miles by railroad to the south, where the iron was used for armory and for naval guns, including the state of the art 11 inches Brooke-Rickett cannon, with the capacity of firing 230-pound shell more than 2,000 yards. By the standards of the antebellum South, the Battlefield Iron Work was a spectacle of industrial wonders. The adjacent village had held church and a schoolhouse surrounded by tenements and small housing for 300 workers. 2 massive brick blast furnaces, each 40 feet high, belched a thick brew of smoke and gas at the top, and a torrent of liquefied iron at the base. Nearby was a rolling mill where the molten iron was formed into crude 100-pound pigs for shipment to Selma and loaded onto a railroad line extending into the factory line. 100 yards away sat a kiln for firing limestone, 10,000 of which was fed each day into the furnace. Beyond the kiln was a quarry of the endless task of preparing the stone furnaces, a sawmill, and then 7,000 acres of forest for which fuel for the constant burning fire was cut. 9 slaves owned by the ironworks were an anomaly. Few industrial enterprises wanted to actually purchase slaves. They were too expensive to acquire, and too costly and difficult to maintain, too unpredictable to when they might become uncooperative or die, far preferable to the slave era industrialist who was to lease the slave chattel owned by other men. In 1864, however, such workers could be found anymore. Instead, the Confederate officer commanding the Deerfield Iron Production Operation Maj. Major William Richard Hunt rented 2,000 slaves to perform the grueling tasks necessary to continue equipping the rebel army. Late in the war, as the need for the air coal and iron capacity grew dire, the federal government began to forcibly impress the slaves held by white in the county. A son of Reverend Starr, a doctor and also a resident of Cottonham Loop, became the government's agent for seizing slaves. There is no surviving record of which black men were pressed into service, but Ward and Cottonham, Shishpole Cottonham, the 63-year-old slave, had shared the farm long this with Master Elsher, had come to identify himself as a foundry man. Almost certainly he had been among those rented to the Deerfield furnace and compelled to help arm the troops fighting to preserve his enslavement. As the war progressed, even large number of local men from near the Cottonham farm left for battle duty. Two of Elijah's sons fought for the Confederacy, Moses and James. Both husbands and fathers each saw gruesome action, personal injury, and captured by the Union. Elijah's grandson, Oliver, too young to fight with the troops, joined the Home Guard and ragtag platoons of old men and teenagers whose job was to patrol the roads for deserters, fleeing slaves, and Union scouts. In the beginning, large crowds gathered at the stores in the crossroad settlement of 6 Mill to send them off. The groups of women worked together to sew the uniforms they wore. Soldiers on the move through the area were a regular sight, crossing the Chaba on the ferry near the mouth of Cottonham Creek and traversing the main road from there toward the rail towns towards the east. Confederate soldiers camped often on the Cottonham farm stretched out in the big fields near the river, foraging from the platoon's supply and food, exchanging spent horses from one first one. At one point late in the war, an entire regiment set camps in the field, erecting tents and lighting cook fires. The appearance of Confederate soldiers must have been an extraordinary event in the lives of the black members of the Cottonham clan. The war years were a conflict period of confused road for slaves. They were the subject of the Union Army's War of Liberation and the victim of South's economic system. Yet at the same time, slaves were also servants and protectors of their white master. In the woods near Cottonham's home, slaves guarded the horses in possession of the white owners, there to avoid raid of northern soldiers. Some slaves took the opportunity to flee, but most stayed at their posts until true liberation came in the spring of 1865. The founding arsenal at Selma and the simple mine of furnace across the Cottonham farm that supplied it with raw materials that taken on outsized importance as the war dragged on. The Alabama manufacturing network became the backbone of the Confederates' ability to make arms. At a Trigard factory were depleted of cigar factories were depleted of raw material and skilled workers, and menaces by the advancing armies of the Ulysses S. Grant. Preservation of the Alabama enterprise was a key element of a last-ditch plan by Jefferson Davis, the Southern president, to retreat with whatever was left of the Confederate military into the Deep South and continue the war. For more than a year, Union forces in southern Tennessee and northern Alabama massed for an anticipated order to obliterate any continued capacity of a rump Confederate government to make arms. Small groups of horse soldiers made regular prodding raids against minimal Southern resistance. In April of 1864, Alabama's governor wired to Confederate Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, commander of rebel forces in Alabama and Mississippi, imploring him to send additional troops. The enemy forces are fortifying their position with their cavalry raiding over the country. It is certain that the forces will work way south and destroy the valuable works in central Alabama. Can nothing be done? Finally, in March 1865, a mass of 13,500 Union cavalrymen swept down from the Tennessee border in one of the North's potent death blows to the rebellion. Commanded by General James S. Wilson, the Union Army were drilled and amply armed, split into three huge raiding parties, each assigned to destroy key elements of Alabama's industrial infrastructure. Moving unchallenged for a day, the Federal troops burned and wrecked the iron forge mill and massive stockpile of cotton and coal at Red Mountain, Irondale, and Helen, north of Bibb County. On the morning of March 30th, Union soldiers slowed down the rain-drenched road in Columbia, destroying the machinery of the Shelby Iron Works, shoving its equipment into local wells and streams, and freeing the slaves critical to its operation. Against nearly hopeless odds, Nathan Bradford Forbes, a former slave dealer who had become the South's most storied horseman, met the Blue advance at a point such of the town of Montevallo. Skirmishing along the Mohave Creek, just miles from the Continental Farm, Forrest's disorganized command could only harass Wilson's advance. The other troops took the Bearfield Furnace on March 30th and left it in ruins. Outmanned and outfought, with flooding creeks blocking his maneuver, Forrest himself was lashed by a saber in savage fighting on April 1st, retreated for a final stand at Selma. The next day, Wilson troops charged the fortified industrial complex in Selma and routed Forrest's remaining 4,000 men. The Confederate general slipped away with an escort of 100 soldiers, massacring as he made his escape most of the contingent of 25 sleeping Union scouts he stumbled upon in the field. Federal forces captured nearly 3,000 of Forrest's men, along with more than 60 pieces of field cannon, score of heavy artillery guns, 9 factories, 5 major iron forges, 3 foundries, 20 locomotives, immense quantities of military supply, and 35,000 bales of cotton. The arsenal, factory shop, and foundries at Selma were systematically destroyed. Perhaps most shocking to local whites, before moving on to attack Georgia, Wilson's officer quickly raised a 1,000-man regiment of black troops placed under the command of the 3rd Ohio Cavalry. with the remaining Confederate armies commanded by General Robert Lee and General Joseph E. Johnston, unable to unify. Jefferson Davis hoped to continue the rebellion as a guerrilla struggle cut off from his remaining troops. His Alabama munition system destroyed, deprived of the last region of relative security in the South. He attempted to flee to Texas or Mexico under hot pressure by a detachment of General Wilson troops. He was captured by Union forces in Georgia weeks later. The war finally came to its end. Alabama had suffered losses totaling $500 million, a sum beyond comprehension, in 1865. The total value of foreign property was reduced during the war from $200 million to less than $98 million, according to the including the loss of slaves. All banks in the state had collapsed. Agricultural production level would not match that of 1860 for another 40 years. But in the final days of the war, proving to be only the beginning of more exorbitant and arduous struggles. A vicious white insurgency against the Union occupation and the specters of black citizens began to take shape. Presaged by the conduction of home guard patrols like the one Olive Cottingham had joined, the patrols, uncoordinated and increasingly temperate of any authority during the war, had come to be known more as bandits and thugs than defenders of the Confederacy. After 4 years of constriction, pillaging, and kidnapping, violent penetrate against critics of rebellion. And ruthless seizures of supplies and property. The Home Guard was in many places as desperate as the Yankee troops. But in the aftermath of a sudden and in much of the South unanticipated surrender, no clear central authority existed in the domestic affair of small places too small or remote to warrant a detachment of Northern troops. In the Deep South, that meant nearly every place outside state capital and economic centers. The result in the 2 year preceding Henry and Mary's wedding was a spreading wave of internecine violence and thievery by returning Confederate soldiers, and particularly against those Southerners who had doubted the war. Deserters, who had been far more numerous than Southern mythology acknowledged, began settling old scores. The increasing lawlessness of the post-war years was, rather than a wave of crime by freed slaves, as so often claimed, largely perpetrated against whites by other whites. The Cottingham farm sat in the middle of this unrest. One gang of deserters in Bibb County, made up of men believed to have abandoned the armies of both the North and the South, called themselves the Uglies, and marched through the countryside during the war, robbing farms and threatening Confederate supporters. Another gang inhabited the Yellow Leaf Swamp on the border with adjoining Clinton County. A pauper military band of men near downtown Montevallo called themselves Blackwell cavalrymen, hunted the countryside of Confederate deserters before the Southern surrendered and continued as an outlaw gang after the war. The group eventually murdered a total of 17 local men. White lawlessness was so rampant in Shelby County that less than 100 years before Henry and Mary's wedding, Union military officials in the Alabama capital threatened to send troops into the area to restore peace. Shelton County had been a hotbed of such guerrilla activity throughout the war and emerged as a refuge for Confederate deserters and Southerners who remained loyal to the Union. A local plantation owner, Captain James Cobb, who had been sent home from duty with the Southern armies due to poor health, was assigned the task of breaking up the gangs of deserters. The Emperor spawned vendettas that would outlast the war. On June 3, 1865, nearly 2 months after the surrender, Cobb was seized by groups of 30 whites and hanged from a tree on his property. Afterwards, they ransacked his home, killing and stealing his livestock. The former Confederate officer was accused of having named 7 of the mob's members as deserters. The Black Rose group sequentially captured the 7 and summarily executed them. On the handful of Union soldiers sent to Benton County to oversee normal local court system during the first 2 years after the war, one was killed at a Centreville Street corner by a Confederate veteran wielding an axe handle. 2 agents of the Freedmen Bureau were assigned to the area in January and February of 1866. The man named Beer and Hinterbaum were promptly whipped by local white and driven from the county not long after. Rumors spread that 2 former slaves named Tom Johnson and Rude Russell had been seen around the county sporting fine clothes paid by Freedmen Bureau agencies. The emancipated slaves planned to live like white folks and marry white wives, according to a newspaper account. Johnson was promptly hanged from a tree on a market street. A few mornings later, passers-by found Russell dangling dead in a tree not far from the scene of the earlier lynching. This includes the reading of Slavery by Another Name off the bookshelf. Your reader has been Nehemiah Suber. Now please join me in additional programming from Raleigh Network and have a wonderful day.